I could always tell what day of the month it was by the sound of the gravel in my driveway. For 29 days out of the month, my home was wrapped in a heavy, uninterrupted silence. The mail carrier's truck would pause at the box by the road, and occasionally the distant drone of a neighbor's lawnmower would drift through the oak trees. But the driveway itself, a long, winding stretch of crushed white stone that my late husband Richard had laid by hand, remained perfectly, painfully still. Until the first of the month. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, the heavy crunch of expensive tires would break the quiet. First came the low, aggressive hum of my son Marcus's Audi. 10 minutes later, as if orchestrated by a silent conductor, the frantic, scattering spray of my daughter Chloe's oversized SUV would follow. They never carpooled. They never arrived together. I always suspected it was because neither wanted to share the enclosed space with the other, stripped of an audience, forced to acknowledge the identical nature of their errands. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the dust settle behind Chloe's car. I held a porcelain teapot with a faintly chipped spout. It was a Wedgwood piece I had purchased on a trip to London 30 years ago, back when my children were small enough to hold my hand in crowded places. The chip had happened when Marcus was a teenager, careless with a backpack. I had never replaced it. I liked the reminder that even broken things can still pour out everything they have. "Mom?" Marcus's voice echoed from the front hallway, loud and artificially warm. "You in the kitchen?" "In here," I called back. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the empty house. He rounded the corner, wearing a suit that cost more than the first car Richard and I had ever owned. At 45, Marcus had inherited his father's sharp jawline, but none of his quiet humility. He leaned in, pressing a dry, rehearsed kiss against my cheek. He didn't linger. His eyes were already scanning the kitchen island, looking for the familiar blue leather folio where I kept the bank documents. "Traffic was a nightmare," he said, loosening his tie, checking his gold wristwatch. "Sylvia sends her love. She wanted to come, but you know how chaotic the mornings are with the kids." "I know," I said softly, setting the teapot down. I knew perfectly well that my daughter-in-law Sylvia was likely at her Pilates studio. She had not visited this house in 4 months. My grandchildren, twin boys who used to run through my hallways laughing, were now 15 and heavily insulated by their mother's busy schedules. I had not seen them since Thanksgiving. It was now late April. Before Marcus could launch into his rehearsed monologue about his business overhead, the front door opened again. "I'm here! God, it is freezing outside," Chloe announced, dropping her heavy leather handbag onto the antique entryway table with a thud that made me wince. She walked into the kitchen, wrapped in a cashmere coat. At 38, Chloe still carried the manic, breathless energy of a teenager who was perpetually late for something important. She offered me a quick one-armed hug, her phone still clutched in her hand. "Sorry I'm late, Mom. The vet called about the dog, and then my accountant needed some forms, and it's just been back-to-back crises all morning." "It's fine, Chloe," I said. "Sit. I made tea." They sat at the kitchen island, side by side. They did not look at each other. They looked at the granite countertop. They looked at the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. They looked everywhere except directly into my eyes. Children rarely notice a mother disappearing until something they need disappears with her. For the past 7 years, since Richard's heart gave out quietly in his sleep, I had been disappearing. I became a ghost haunting my own life. When Richard was alive, he was the patriarch. He controlled the finances, the family trust, the businesses. When he died, everyone assumed I was simply a grieving, fragile widow who didn't understand the complex web of accounts he left behind. They were wrong. I understood every penny. I simply chose not to wield it like a weapon. To make the transition easier for them, to ensure my children never felt the cold reality of losing their father's safety net, I had left the joint accounts open. I authorized the monthly transfers to Marcus's Business Development Fund, a polite fiction for his lifestyle expenses. I paid the minimums and often the maximums on the platinum credit line Chloe used for her emergencies. Over the years, the financial support mutated. It stopped being a gift. It became an expectation, then a right, finally an unspoken demand. I poured the tea. A thin ribbon of steam rose between us. "So," Marcus began, clearing his throat, capping his fingers against the granite, "how are you holding up, Mom? The house isn't too much for you?" "I manage," I said, sliding a cup toward him. "You know, Sylvia and I were talking. Maybe it's time to think about downsizing. This place is huge. The property taxes alone." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "I like my garden, Marcus." Of course, he backpedaled smoothly. "Just looking out for you." His phone vibrated on the counter. The screen lit up. He had left it face up, a careless mistake he rarely made. From my angle, standing across the narrow island, the text message was perfectly legible. It was from Sylvia. "Did she authorize the transfer yet? The contractor needs the deposit today for the pool house. Don't let her stall. Just smile and drink the tea." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. My hands remained perfectly steady on the teapot, but behind my ribs, a cold, dark fissure cracked open. "Just smile and drink the tea." I looked at Marcus. He quickly snatched the phone, swiping the notification away with a casual flick of his thumb, offering me a tight, artificial smile. "Just Sylvia," he said smoothly, "checking in on you." "How kind of her," I murmured. I shifted my gaze to Chloe. She was typing rapidly on her own phone, her tea entirely untouched. She sighed heavily, a theatrical sound designed to draw my attention. "Everything all right, Chloe?" I asked, playing my part. "It's just the transmission on the SUV. The mechanic says it's going to be $4,000. I honestly don't know how I'm going to cover it this week with the kids' tuition due." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, practicing a look of helpless panic she had perfected at age 12. There was no transmission issue. I knew this because the insurance tracker attached to her vehicle, which I paid for, showed she had driven it to a luxury ski resort 3 days ago. I looked at my 2 beautiful, well-dressed strangers. I had wiped their tears. I had stayed up through the night monitoring their fevers. I had hidden their father's harsher judgments from them. I had absorbed their mistakes so they could walk through life unburdened. Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access. For 7 years, I thought my financial support was keeping our family connected. I thought the first of the month was a tether that kept my children in my life. But standing in the quiet of my kitchen, watching Marcus check his watch and Chloe fake a sigh of despair, the illusion shattered. They didn't come to see me. They came to collect a toll. I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was an administrative hurdle. "Well," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I smoothed the front of my cardigan. "I suppose we should handle the paperwork, shouldn't we?" Marcus's shoulders instantly dropped in relief. Chloe put her phone down. The tension in the room evaporated, replaced by the eager, hungry energy of an impending transaction. "If you don't mind, Mom, I really have to get back to the office," Marcus said, standing up. "I'll go get the ledger," I said. I turned my back on them and walked slowly out of the kitchen, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me. I climbed the wooden stairs, my hand sliding along the oak banister. Every step felt heavier than the last, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I walked into my bedroom and sat at Richard's heavy mahogany desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the blue leather ledger. Inside were the checkbooks, the wire transfer fobs, the account numbers. I looked at the line items, the tens of thousands of dollars bleeding out of my life every single month to fund their entitlement. I picked up my pen. But I didn't reach for the checkbook. Instead, I reached for my private cell phone, the one they didn't have the number for, and I dialed the private banker Richard had trusted for 40 years. "Hello, Eleanor," the banker answered warmly. "It's good to hear your voice. How can I help you today?" I looked at the closed bedroom door, listening to the faint murmur of my children downstairs, waiting for their money. "Arthur," I said, my voice perfectly steady, stripped of all warmth and hesitation. "I need to close some accounts. All of them, actually. Effective immediately." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Arthur had been Richard's wealth manager since the late 80s. He was a man who trafficked in caution and predictable yields, a man who viewed sudden financial movements with the suspicion of a seasoned detective. "Eleanor," Arthur said slowly, his voice dropping an octave, "when you say all of the accounts, you are including the platinum credit lines, the joint reserve fund, the commercial revolving account Marcus uses for his firm?" "I mean every account that bears my signature alongside theirs," I said. "I want their authorized user statuses revoked. I want the credit lines frozen. Move the liquid assets from the joint reserve into the blind trust Richard established for me, the one they cannot access." I heard the rapid, muffled clicking of a keyboard on Arthur's end. "Eleanor, if I execute this now, it is immediate. If Chloe tries to swipe her card to buy a coffee an hour from now, it will be declined. If Marcus has automated payroll drawing from that commercial line, his checks will bounce by tomorrow morning. It will be a hard stop." He was giving me a chance to back down, to be the soft, yielding mother I had played for 7 years. "I am aware of how banking works, Arthur." I looked at the framed photograph on my desk. It was a picture of Marcus and Chloe as children, standing in the snow, their cheeks red, holding onto my hands for balance. Are there any legal barriers to my request? None, Arthur said quietly. As the primary trustee, the capital is entirely yours. I know your family, Eleanor. This is going to cause an earthquake. Let it shake, I said. Call me when the confirmations are generated. I hung up the phone. My hand was not trembling. I found that entirely fascinating. For years, the mere thought of disappointing my children would send a spike of anxiety through my chest. Now there was only a cool, anesthetic calm spreading through my veins. It felt like setting a broken bone. Painful, yes, but necessary for the limb to heal properly. When a mother continuously buys her children's affection, she is only renting her own relevance, and my lease had just expired. I closed the blue ledger, leaving the checkbook perfectly intact inside, and walked back downstairs. As I reached the bottom step, I paused in the shadows of the hallway. The kitchen was just around the corner. I could hear them talking, their voices stripped of the polite, strained patience they used with me. I don't know why she insists on this little ritual every month, Chloe was complaining, the clinking of her spoon against the saucer underscoring her irritation. It takes her 20 minutes to write a simple check. We should just have her set up an auto wire. It's 2024, for God's sake. Don't push it, Marcus replied, his tone low and authoritative. She's old, Chloe. The monthly visit makes her feel important. If you take that away, she'll start asking questions about where the money goes. Let her have her tea and her delusions. It costs us half an hour a month. Let her have her delusions. I pressed my hand against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. The words didn't break my heart. My heart had already been dismantled, piece by piece, over the last 7 years. Instead, the words hardened something deep inside my chest. I stepped into the light of the kitchen. Instantly, the masks slid back on. Marcus stood up straighter, adjusting his cuffs, while Chloe offered me a bright, vacant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything all right, Mom?" Marcus asked. "Yes," I said, walking back to my spot behind the island. I rested my hands on the granite countertop. "It's all taken care of." It wasn't a lie. It was just a different kind of truth. "Fantastic," Marcus said, letting out a heavy breath. He reached for his briefcase. "I hate to eat and run, Mom, but I have a lunch meeting with a prospective client across town. And I have to get to the mechanic before they close the bay," Chloe added, already shrugging into her cashmere coat. They didn't wait for my response. They didn't offer to clear their teacups. They moved with the hurried, chaotic efficiency of thieves leaving a vault. "Drive safely," I said to their backs. Marcus threw a casual wave over his shoulder. Chloe didn't look back at all. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind them. A few moments later, the gravel outside crunched aggressively as both luxury cars sped down the long driveway, eager to escape the suffocating presence of the woman who funded their lives. The silence rushed back into the house. I walked over to the kitchen island. Marcus had taken exactly 2 sips of his tea. Chloe's cup was completely untouched, the surface of the liquid perfectly still and rapidly cooling. I picked up the chipped Wedgwood teapot, carried it to the sink, and poured the remaining tea down the drain. Then I walked into the sunroom and sat in Richard's old reading chair. I set my iPad on my lap and logged into my private banking portal. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The house ticked and breathed around me. Outside, a light, freezing rain began to fall, tapping gently against the large bay windows. I watched the water trace unpredictable paths down the glass. At precisely 11:42 a.m., a small red notification appeared in the top right corner of my screen. I tapped it. Alert. Transaction declined. Card ending in 4092. Authorized user, Sylvia Sterling. Amount, $15,000. Merchant, Coastal Luxury Pools and Spas. Reason, account frozen/closed. I stared at the red text. I could perfectly picture Sylvia standing in the contractor's showroom, her designer handbag on her arm, offering her polished, condescending smile to the cashier, entirely confident that the Bank of Eleanor would clear the way. The iPad pinged again. Alert! Transaction declined. Card ending in 8814. Authorized user, Chloe Sterling. Amount, $4,200. Merchant, the Alpine Ski Resort and Spa, concierge desk. Reason, account frozen/closed. Not a mechanic. The concierge desk. She hadn't even bothered to drive home before charging her next vacation. My cell phone, resting on the side table, began to vibrate. The screen lit up. The caller ID flashed Marcus's name. He never called me before 6 p.m. unless he needed something. The phone buzzed aggressively, vibrating against the polished wood, demanding my attention, demanding my compliance, demanding the invisible safety net I had woven for him his entire life. I reached out, and I turned the phone face down. The vibration stopped. The silence in the sunroom returned, heavy and absolute, save for the rhythmic patter of the freezing rain against the glass. I leaned back in Richard's leather chair, closing my eyes. I expected to feel guilt. I expected the ingrained maternal instinct to fix things, to rush to the phone, apologize for the bank error, and smoothly reinstate their comfort. But the instinct was gone. It had been systematically starved to death by years of transactional love. 5 minutes later, the house phone rang. It was a landline, an old rotary-style phone I kept in the hallway primarily for nostalgia. Its ring was loud, jarring, and impossible to ignore. It shrilled through the empty rooms, echoing off the high ceilings. I didn't move. It rang 4 times, went to the answering machine, and a moment later, Marcus's voice filled the downstairs hallway. He was on speakerphone, and his tone was tightly controlled, a forced casualness masking a rising current of panic. "Mom, hey, it's Marcus." Listen, the strangest thing just happened. Sylvia tried to put the deposit down on the pool house, and the card was declined. The bank is probably just doing one of those automated fraud checks because it was a large amount. Could you call Arthur and have him clear it? The contractor is holding the crew for us, so I need this handled in the next hour. Call me back. The machine clicked off. Before the silence could fully settle, the landline rang again. This time, the answering machine captured a very different tone. It was Chloe. Her voice was high-pitched, frantic, and entirely devoid of her usual polished veneer. Mom, pick up! It's an emergency! My card isn't working. I'm at the mechanic, and my card is declining, and I need to pay them right now, or they're going to keep the car. "Mom, pick up the phone! Call the bank! This is embarrassing!" I sat perfectly still in the sunroom. She wasn't at the mechanic. The declined transaction had clearly originated from the ski resort's concierge desk. She was lying to me in real time, demanding that I fund her deception while simultaneously protecting her from the consequences of it. I picked up my iPad again. The red alerts were stacking up rapidly now, a digital cascade of financial failure. Alert: commercial transfer failed. Amount: $22,000. Recipient: Sterling Architecture Group, payroll account. Reason: insufficient funds / line closed. Marcus had attempted to run his firm's payroll through my commercial line. Again. He had sworn to me 3 years ago that his business was self-sustaining, that he only needed the line open just in case of a market downturn. He had been lying for 3 years. I was funding the very salary he used to boast about at dinner parties. I watched the red notifications populate my screen, feeling like an archaeologist unearthing the fossilized remains of my family's deceit. Everything they had, everything they projected to the world, was built on the quiet, uninterrupted flow of my money. They were not successful adults. They were heavily subsidized actors playing a role. My cell phone began to vibrate again. This time it wasn't Marcus or Chloe. It was Sylvia. I stared at her name on the screen. Sylvia, who had texted her husband to just smile and drink the tea. Sylvia, who hadn't brought my grandchildren to see me in 4 months because she found my presence depressing. I picked up the phone and answered. "Hello, Sylvia," I said softly. "Eleanor!" Her voice was breathy, artificially sweet, but laced with a sharp, undeniable edge of anxiety. "Oh, thank goodness you answered. Marcus couldn't get a hold of you." "I was in the garden," I lied smoothly. "Well, listen, there's a bit of a crisis. I'm standing here with the pool contractors, and the card you gave us, well, the bank is being ridiculous. They've locked the account." "It's highly embarrassing, Eleanor. I need you to call them right now and authorize the $15,000. She didn't ask. She commanded. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained, she didn't even realize she was speaking to me like an employee who had botched a delivery. "I'm sorry, Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost vaguely confused. "Did you say 15,000? "Yes, for the pool house deposit. Marcus said he talked to you about it." "He didn't mention a pool house," I said truthfully. "He mentioned business overhead." There was a microsecond of silence on the line. I could hear the gears turning in Sylvia's head as she realized her husband had lied to both of us. "Well," Sylvia recovered quickly, her tone sharpening, "it doesn't matter what he called it. The point is, the funds were supposed to be available, and now I'm standing here looking like a fool. You need to call Arthur." "I did call Arthur," I said quietly. "Great! Did he fix it?" "No, Sylvia. I called him to close the accounts." The silence that followed was not brief. It was a long, cavernous pause. The artificial sweetness vanished entirely from the line, replaced by a cold, sudden shock. "You what?" she whispered. "I closed the joint accounts," I repeated, my tone as calm as if I were discussing the weather. "The credit lines are frozen. The authorized user statuses have been revoked. The accounts no longer exist." "Eleanor, this isn't funny," she snapped, her voice trembling with rising anger. "I am standing in front of people." "It isn't a joke, Sylvia. The money is no longer available." "Why would you do that without telling us?" she demanded, her voice raising to a shrill pitch. "You can't just cut us off. Marcus relies on that account. We rely on that account. You know we have the twins' private school tuition due next week." "Marcus is a 45-year-old architect, Sylvia. I am sure he has his own funds to cover his children's education." "You know his firm is struggling right now," she practically screamed. "We are tapped out. If you don't turn that card back on, I'm going to have to cancel the contractors, and we're going to lose our spot in the schedule." "Then I suppose you will have to wait for the pool house," I said. "Eleanor—" "I have to go, Sylvia. The tea is getting cold." I ended the call. I didn't block her number. I didn't turn the phone off. I set it back down on the side table, perfectly content to let the consequences of their reality crash down around them. For decades, my role in this family was to absorb their panic and hand them solutions. If a car broke down, I bought a new one. If a business stumbled, I injected capital. If a marriage was strained, I paid for the luxury vacation to smooth it over. I had padded the walls of their lives so thickly with money that they never felt the impact of their own mistakes. They thought they were invincible. But they weren't. They were just expensive. The iPad chimed one last time. It was a text message from Chloe. It didn't contain an apology. It didn't contain an explanation. It was a photograph of a transmission repair bill for $4,000, followed by 2 words: "Pay this." I looked at the image. The bill was real, but the date on it was from 3 years ago. She had kept an old invoice on her phone specifically to use as a prop whenever she needed to extract cash from me. She wasn't just entitled, she was systematically defrauding me. I closed the iPad, stood up from Richard's chair, and walked into the hallway. I paused by the grandfather clock. Its heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, a steady, relentless heartbeat in the quiet house. My children had spent 7 years treating me like an ATM in a waiting room. They were about to discover what happens when the machine unplugs itself and the doors lock from the outside. By 2 p.m., the storm outside had intensified. The freezing rain had turned into sleet, hitting the windows like handfuls of dropped gravel. Inside, the house felt remarkably warm, insulated by the heavy drapes and the quiet hum of the furnace. My phone had rung 14 times in the span of 2 hours. 10 calls from Marcus, 4 from Chloe. Sylvia had resorted to text messages. Her initial demands had quickly devolved into a frantic, escalating stream of accusations, claiming I was ruining her reputation in the neighborhood by forcing her to walk away from the pool contractors. I had read each message, filed it away in my memory, and deleted the thread. I was in the kitchen, carefully wiping down the granite countertops, when the silence was finally shattered by the sound of an engine pushing aggressively up the driveway. It was moving too fast for the weather. The tires slipped slightly on the wet gravel before slamming to a halt near the front steps. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The heavy, slamming thud of the driver's side door belonged to Marcus. I rinsed the sponge, wrung it out, and draped it over the center divider of the sink. I smoothed the front of my cardigan and walked slowly toward the entryway, arriving just as the heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Marcus stood in the threshold. He was entirely drenched. He had clearly abandoned his umbrella in his rush to the door. His expensive suit was dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his usually composed, arrogant face was twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. "Mom!" he shouted, stepping into the hallway, tracking wet footprints onto the Persian rug. "What the hell is going on?" I stood a few feet away, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked at his wet shoes, then up at his face. "Take your shoes off, Marcus," I said quietly. "You're ruining the rug." He stared at me, his chest heaving, as if he had just run a marathon. For a second, he looked completely disoriented by my calm. He was expecting the anxious, accommodating mother who would immediately apologize for his distress. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged space. "The rug? I just got off the phone with Arthur. He said you closed the commercial line. He said you locked the joint reserves. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I do," I said. "I closed the accounts." "Why?" He took a step forward, his hands gesturing wildly. "You didn't say a word this morning. We sat right there in the kitchen. We had tea, and you said everything was fine." "I said everything was taken care of," I corrected him mildly, and it was. Marcus stopped. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, searching my face for the familiar signs of weakness, of maternal guilt. When he found none, a new emotion flickered across his features. Fear. "Mom, you don't understand," he said, his voice dropping slightly, the aggression shifting into a frantic, pleading negotiation. "I have payroll tomorrow morning. I have 14 employees. If that line is closed, the checks bounce. If the checks bounce, the firm is done. You have to call Arthur back right now and tell him you made a mistake. Tell him you were confused." "I am not confused, Marcus." "Then why are you doing this?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, pacing a tight circle in the entryway. "Is it Sylvia? Is it the pool house? Because I can explain that. I was going to tell you, I didn't want you to worry about how much it cost. But it's an investment in the property value." "It isn't about the pool house," I said. "Then what is it?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the sharp lines of his face, the graying hair at his temples, the expensive watch on his wrist that I had purchased for his 40th birthday. He was a grown man, a father of 2, standing in my hallway, screaming at me because I had finally stopped paying his bills. "It's about the tea," I said softly. Marcus stopped pacing. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. "What?" "You don't like the tea, Marcus. You never have, but you drink it. For 20 minutes, once a month, you sit at my kitchen island and pretend to care about my garden or my health because you think that's the toll you have to pay to access my checkbook." His face flushed, a dark, angry red creeping up his neck. "That is insane. I come here because I love you." "You come here because it's payday," I said. My voice didn't rise. It remained perfectly level, a quiet, devastating fact resting between us. "You sat in my kitchen this morning and texted your wife to smile and drink the tea while you waited for me to authorize a transfer for a pool house you lied about." Marcus froze. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him. He had left his phone on the counter. He had been so entirely dismissive of me, so certain of my invisibility, that he hadn't even bothered to hide his contempt. "Mom, you misunderstood," he stammered, the smooth, arrogant architect suddenly stumbling over his words. "That was just, Sylvia was stressed, and I was trying to calm her down." I didn't misunderstand anything, Marcus. I took a slow step forward. I have understood perfectly for 7 years. I understood when you ran your firm's payroll through my account for 3 years straight while telling me your business was thriving. I understood when you stopped bringing my grandsons to visit, unless it was Christmas and you expected a check. I understood that my only value to you was my signature on a bank transfer. "That isn't true," he protested, but his voice was thin, lacking conviction. "It is entirely true," I replied, "and it is entirely over." He stared at me, his breathing ragged. The silence in the hallway felt suffocating. He realized in that moment that the safety net had not just been temporarily removed, it had been incinerated. "You're going to destroy my firm," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Over a text message? Over bruised feelings? You're going to ruin your own son's life?" "I am not destroying your firm," I said calmly. "I am simply no longer funding it. If your business cannot survive 24 hours without my money, then you do not have a business, Marcus. You have a hobby that I have been subsidizing." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He actually recoiled, his shoulders slumping, the facade of the successful businessman completely collapsing in the wet hallway of his childhood home. Before he could formulate a response, the sound of a second engine cut through the sleet outside. It was louder, heavier. The grating sound of tires locking up on the gravel preceded the frantic slam of another car door. "Oh, God," Marcus muttered, turning toward the window. The front door burst open. Chloe stood there, shivering in a thin designer sweater, her hair a wild, wind-blown mess. She didn't even notice Marcus. Her eyes locked onto me with a wild, feral desperation. "You!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Do you have any idea what you just did to me?" I looked at my daughter. The audience was fully assembled. The play was about to enter its final act. Chloe marched into the hallway, leaving the front door wide open behind her. The freezing rain blew in, chilling the air immediately, but I didn't move to close it. "I was at the concierge desk," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the plaster walls. "I was standing next to the head of the PTA, Mom. Do you know how humiliating it is to have your card declined in front of Rebecca Sterling? She practically laughed at me." "You told me you were at the mechanic, Chloe," I said quietly. Chloe stopped, her mouth snapping shut. She looked from me to Marcus, who was standing frozen by the staircase, then back to me. The sudden pivot in my tone, the fact that I was actively catching her in a lie rather than asking how to fix her embarrassment, threw her entirely off balance. The mechanic is next week," she stammered, crossing her arms defensively. "That's not the point. The point is you cut off my card without warning me. I had to leave my groceries at the register. I had to beg the resort to hold our reservation."
"Why would you do this?"
"Because," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I am not paying for another ski trip." "It's not just a ski trip," she yelled, stepping closer, trying to intimidate me with volume. "It's a networking weekend for the kids. Everyone from their private school goes. You want your grandchildren to be left out? You want them to be the only ones who can't afford to go?" "They can go, Chloe. You simply have to pay for it." She let out a harsh, barking laugh, throwing her hands in the air. "With what money? Dan's salary barely covers the mortgage and the car payments. You know that." "Then perhaps you should not have lied to me this morning about a transmission failure to steal $4,000, I replied. The word steal hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute. Chloe's face flushed violently. She opened her mouth to deny it, but I didn't give her the chance. "I saw the invoice you texted me, Chloe. The date was from 3 years ago. It's the same invoice you used to get money out of me last February, and the October before that. You keep it on your phone like a coupon." Her eyes widened in horror. She looked at Marcus, silently begging him to intervene, to play the mediator he always played when he needed me distracted. But Marcus was staring at the floor, his jaw tight, completely consumed by his own impending financial collapse. "Mom," Chloe's voice cracked. The anger instantly evaporated, replaced by the practiced, weeping victimhood she had weaponized since childhood. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. "Please, you don't understand how hard it is right now. Dan and I are struggling. I just wanted the kids to have a normal weekend. I panicked. I'm sorry I lied. Just call Arthur and turn the card back on. Please." She reached out, grabbing my hands. Her fingers were freezing. For 7 years, this exact physical contact, the tears, the clinging, the desperate apologies, would have broken me. I would have folded immediately, pulling her into a hug, whispering that it was okay, that I understood, that money didn't matter as long as we had each other. But as her cold hands gripped mine, I felt absolutely nothing. "Let go of my hands, Chloe," I said. She recoiled as if I had burned her. "You're being cruel," she whispered, her voice trembling genuinely now. "Dad wouldn't have done this. Dad would never have let us drown like this." "Your father," I said slowly, "is the one who set up the blind trust. He knew exactly what you both were." Marcus snapped his head up, his eyes wide. "What?" "Did you think Richard was an idiot?" I asked, looking between the two of them. "Did you think he built a multi-million-dollar estate by being blind to the people around him? Your father saw how you spent money, Chloe. He saw how you ran your business into the ground, Marcus. When he got sick, he told me to cut you both off." They stood frozen. The ghost of their father had just walked into the hallway, rendering his final judgment. "He said you were parasites," I continued, the words slipping out of me with a devastating calmness. "He said you would bleed me dry the moment he was gone. He wanted to lock everything in the trust before he died." "Why didn't he?" Marcus croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I begged him not to," I said. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entryway. The only sound was the freezing rain lashing against the open front door. "I begged him," I repeated, my voice dropping lower, but carrying perfectly in the quiet house. "I told him you just needed time, that you were just finding your footing, that if we supported you a little longer, you would eventually stand on your own. I fought your father for you." I looked at Marcus. I defended your failing business.
I looked at Chloe.
I defended your reckless spending. I spent 7 years, I said, proving your father wrong. I poured millions of dollars into your lives to prove to a dead man that our children loved us for who we were, not what we could buy them. I took a slow breath, feeling the final heavy lock clicking into place inside my chest. And today, I said softly, you proved him right. Chloe began to sob openly, covering her face with her hands. Marcus leaned heavily against the wall, staring at me with a mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. Mom, please, Marcus pleaded, his voice breaking. If I miss payroll tomorrow, my partners will force a buyout. I'll lose the firm. I'll lose everything. Then you will lose everything, I said. You can't do this, Chloe screamed through her tears, dropping her hands from her face. You're our mother.
It's your job to help us.
My job, I said, ended the moment you decided I was an obstacle instead of a parent. I turned my back on them and walked slowly up the stairs. Mom, Marcus yelled, stepping toward the staircase. Mom, come back here. We aren't finished. I paused on the landing, looking down at the 2 strangers standing in my hallway. We have been finished for a very long time, I said. Close the front door on your way out. You're letting the cold in. I continued up the stairs, walked into my bedroom, and quietly shut the door. I stood in the center of my room, listening. For 5 long minutes, the only sound was Chloe's muffled sobbing. Then I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. A moment later, the aggressive crunch of tires on wet gravel echoed through the walls as they fled the property. They were gone. I walked over to my bed and sat down. The house was entirely silent again. But for the first time in 7 years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt clean. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I picked it up. It was a text from Arthur at the bank. Eleanor. The commercial line closure triggered an alert. Marcus's business partners have been notified of the insufficient funds. They are requesting an emergency board meeting. Shall I redirect their inquiries to him directly? I typed my reply with steady hands. Yes, Arthur. Redirect everything to him. And please, forward all of Chloe's future bills to her husband's office. I pressed send. The first domino had officially fallen, and I was going to sit perfectly still and watch the rest of them go down. By 6 o'clock that evening, the sleet had frozen solid, coating the bare branches of the oak trees in thick, glittering layers of ice. The heavy limbs sagged under the weight, occasionally cracking in the dark with a sharp, pistol-like snap that echoed across the empty lawn. Inside, I turned on the dim hallway lights and walked into the kitchen. I prepared a single portion of roasted salmon and asparagus. I did not rush. For the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't have to check my phone to see if Chloe needed me to order takeout for her family because she was too exhausted to cook, or if Marcus needed me to authorize a last-minute wire for a vendor. The silence was no longer an absence of noise. It was a presence. It was a thick, protective blanket settling over the house. I sat at the small breakfast table by the window, eating quietly. On the drying rack next to the sink, the chipped Wedgwood teapot sat upside down, emptied and washed clean. When you stop shielding people from their own consequences, they will inevitably accuse you of attacking them. To the parasite, the host's boundary feels like an act of violence. At 6:45 p.m., the house landline rang. I took a slow sip of water, patted my mouth with a linen napkin, and walked to the hallway. The caller ID glowed softly in the dim light. Daniel Vance. Dan. Chloe's husband. Dan was not a bad man, but he was a deeply oblivious one. He worked as a mid-level logistics manager, bringing home a respectable, quiet salary that Chloe had always treated with a thinly veiled, patronizing disdain. Dan believed they lived within their means. He believed Chloe was simply a master of budgeting, hunting down sales and stretching his paycheck to afford the luxury cars, the private schools, and the endless vacations. He had no idea that his entire life was subsidized by his mother-in-law. Chloe had explicitly forbidden me from ever discussing money in front of him, claiming it would hurt his pride as a provider. I picked up the receiver. "Hello, Dan." "Eleanor?" Dan's voice was thick with confusion, pitched low as if he were hiding in a closet. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine, Dan. How are the girls?" They're good, doing homework." He hesitated, the sound of static filling the line. "Listen, Eleanor, I'm really confused. I just got an email from Arthur at your bank. He forwarded me a stack of invoices and an outstanding balance statement for a platinum card." "I see." "It has to be a mistake," Dan said, his voice carrying a nervous, apologetic chuckle. "There's an invoice here for $4,000 from an alpine ski resort, and another one for a transmission repair that's dated 3 years ago. Arthur's note said to direct all future correspondence regarding Chloe's debts to my office. Has Chloe's identity been stolen?" I leaned against the wall, watching the brass pendulum of the grandfather clock swing in the shadows. "Her identity hasn't been stolen, Dan," I said gently. "Then why?" "Those are Chloe's charges," I explained, keeping my voice steady and entirely devoid of malice. "For the past 7 years, Chloe has been an authorized user on my accounts. I have been paying her credit cards, covering her vacations, and funding her emergencies. Today, I closed those accounts. Arthur is simply forwarding her outstanding balances to her legal spouse." There was a long, terrible silence on the line. I could hear Dan breathing. 7 years, he finally whispered. "Yes." The trip to Aspen last winter. She said she won a sales contest at the boutique." "I paid for Aspen, Dan. It was $12,000. "The private school tuition." His voice was breaking now, fracturing under the weight of a decade of deception. "I have paid the tuition in full on the 1st of September every year since they enrolled." "Oh, my God," Dan breathed. The sound was not angry. It was entirely gutted. He was a man waking up in a house he suddenly realized did not belong to him. "We don't have any money, Eleanor. My salary covers the mortgage and the groceries." "If she has thousands of dollars in floating debt." "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, Dan." "Why did you hide it from me?" he asked, a brief flare of hurt finally breaking through his shock. "Because I thought I was helping," I said honestly, "and because a mother will do very foolish things to prevent her daughter from being unhappy. But I am no longer funding the illusion. You need to speak with your wife." "She's locked in the bedroom," Dan said numbly. "She's been crying since she got home. She told me you had a nervous breakdown." "I am the clearest I have been in years, Dan. Good night." I hung up the phone. I felt a brief pang of sympathy for him, but I did not regret the call. Dan was collateral damage, yes, but he was also a grown man who had chosen to look the other way while his wife brought home designer clothes on a logistics manager's salary. As I walked away from the landline, my cell phone chimed in my cardigan pocket. It was an audio message from Sylvia. I tapped the screen and held the phone up. Sylvia didn't sound frantic anymore. She sounded cold, precise, and lethally calm. The voice of a woman who had realized her charm was useless and had immediately pivoted to extortion. "Listen to me very carefully, Eleanor," Sylvia's recorded voice played in the quiet hallway. "I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but you have humiliated me for the last time. Marcus is at the office in a complete panic, trying to secure a bridge loan because of your little stunt. You think you hold all the cards because you have Richard's money, but you don't." She paused. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background. My grandson's somewhere nearby. "I control access to your grandsons," she continued smoothly. "If you do not call Arthur by 9 a.m. tomorrow and reopen that commercial line, you will never see the boys again. I will tell them you lost your mind. I will tell them you cut their father off to be cruel. You will die alone in that ridiculous, drafty house, and we won't even come to the funeral. Turn the money back on, Eleanor, or you are dead to this family." The message ended with a sharp beep. I stood perfectly still. Decades ago, a threat like that would have brought me to my knees. The mere thought of losing access to my grandchildren would have sent me rushing to the bank with a blank check, begging for forgiveness. But Sylvia had miscalculated. She was trying to weaponize an absence I had already grieved. She hadn't brought the boys to see me in 4 months. When they did come, they sat on my sofa staring at their phones, conditioned by their mother to view me as a boring, necessary chore. She was threatening to take away something she had already stolen. I deleted the audio message. I didn't even bother to reply. Instead, I walked to the front entryway table. Earlier that morning, before the circus of my children's arrival, the mail carrier had dropped off a thick, certified manila envelope. I hadn't opened it. I picked it up now. The return address belonged to a commercial real estate holding firm in the city. I carried it into Richard's office, turned on the brass desk lamp, and sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. I slid the documents onto the leather blotter. It was a notice of intent to foreclose. I frowned, adjusting my reading glasses. The property address listed was a commercial warehouse district downtown, a development project Marcus had pitched to his partners 2 years ago. He had told me the project fell through. But looking at the document, I saw that it hadn't fallen through. It had been funded to the tune of $2.5 million. And according to the final page of the defaulted loan agreement, resting starkly against the white paper in blue ink, was the signature of the primary guarantor, Eleanor Sterling. I stared at the signature. It was an excellent forgery. It mirrored the slant of my E and the trailing loop of my G perfectly. But it was a forgery nonetheless. Marcus hadn't just been bleeding my accounts dry. When I refused to give him the capital for his risky development 2 years ago, he had used his access to my financial records to secure the loan in my name. The ice outside cracked again, a violent snapping sound in the dark. I reached for my phone. It was time to call my lawyer. "Hello, Eleanor. It's quite late. Is everything all right?" Robert Vance's voice was warm, gravelly, and instantly grounding. He was not just my attorney. He had been Richard's closest confidant for 30 years. He knew the structural integrity of my family better than anyone, precisely because he had drafted all the legal scaffolding that kept it upright. "I apologize for calling you at home, Robert," I said, sitting heavily in Richard's leather office chair. "But I'm afraid I found something that cannot wait until morning." "I'm in my study," Robert said, the sound of a rustling newspaper echoing faintly over the line. "Take your time. What is it?" "I closed the joint accounts today, all of them." There was a profound, weighted silence on the other end. Robert had practically begged me to sever their financial access the week after Richard's funeral. When I refused, out of some misguided sense of maternal duty, he had simply nodded, drafted the authorization papers, and warned me that I was building a cage out of gold. "I see," Robert said slowly. "I imagine Marcus and Chloe took the news with grace and dignity?" "Marcus came to the house and screamed at me. Chloe lied about a car repair and then cried when I confronted her. Sylvia left me a voicemail threatening to withhold the grandchildren forever if I didn't reinstate Marcus's commercial line." "Eleanor," Robert sighed, the weariness in his voice betraying his lack of surprise. "I am so incredibly sorry. But I am also profoundly relieved. You have carried them for far too long." "That is not why I am calling, Robert." I touched the edge of the certified letter resting on the desk. The paper felt thick, heavy with consequence. "I received a certified notice today from a firm called Vanguard Commercial Holdings," I said, my voice dropping into a flat, clinical tone. "It is a notice of intent to foreclose on a warehouse development project downtown. The outstanding debt is $2.5 million. "Marcus's old project," Robert said immediately. "The one he pitched to the board 2 years ago. I thought they failed to secure capital." "So did I replied. "But they didn't. They secured it through Vanguard, and the loan is in default." "Eleanor, why would Vanguard send the notice to you?" Robert's voice suddenly sharpened, the warmth evaporating, replaced by the precise, surgical tone of a litigator. "You hold no equity in his firm. You didn't underwrite that project. I made sure of it." "They sent it to me," I said quietly, "because my signature is on the guarantor line." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the receiver. "Are you absolutely certain?" Robert asked. "Is it possible Marcus slipped the document into a stack of routine trust paperwork and you signed it without noticing?" "No. I read everything I sign, Robert. You know that. And the date on the signature line is from September 14th of last year. I was in London visiting my sister for 2 weeks in September. I wasn't even in the country." "He forged it," Robert said. The words hung in the air, blunt and irreversible. "Yes." "Eleanor, do you understand what this means?" Robert's voice was urgent now. "This isn't an overdrawn credit card. This isn't a spoiled child demanding an allowance. This is federal wire fraud. This is felony forgery." If Vanguard brings this to court and they discover Marcus falsified the signature of the primary trustee to secure $2.5 million, he will go to prison, I finished for him. Yes, he will. Robert paused. Unless you validate the signature. I looked at the framed photograph on the desk. It was Marcus on his college graduation day. He was smiling broadly, holding his diploma, looking out at the world with the absolute certainty of a young man who believed he could never fail. I remembered buying him the suit he wore in that picture. I remembered adjusting his tie. I remembered the pride swelling in my chest. If I validate the signature, I said softly, the trust is liable for the $2.5 million. Yes, Robert said. Vanguard will liquidate the asset, but they will come after your personal accounts for the deficiency. It will be a significant hit to your estate, Eleanor, but it would shield Marcus from criminal liability. He would just be a businessman who defaulted on a loan. Just smile and drink the tea. The text message flashed through my mind, brilliant and sickening. Marcus hadn't just been stealing my money. He had been betting my security against his own ambition, fully confident that if he failed, I would simply absorb the impact without a word. He had weaponized my silence. Eleanor? Robert asked gently. I know this is an impossible choice for a mother. I can reach out to Vanguard tomorrow. We can quietly settle the debt. No one has to know. No, I said. No? Do not call Vanguard, I said, my voice hardening. Do not settle the debt. Do not cover for him. Eleanor, if we don't intercept this, Vanguard will initiate the audit. Once they pull the notary records and realize the guarantor wasn't present, the criminal investigation will be automatic. It will be out of our hands. I know. You are willing to let him face indictment? I am willing to let him face the reality he built, I corrected. For 7 years, I have been the shock absorber for this family, Robert. I have prevented every consequence from reaching them. I am done. I will not pay $2.5 million to validate a lie. Understood, Robert said quietly. He sounded incredibly sad, but deeply respectful. What would you like me to do? Draft a sworn affidavit stating that I was out of the country on the date of the signature and that I categorically deny guaranteeing the loan for Vanguard Commercial Holdings. I will sign it in your office tomorrow morning. You may send it directly to Vanguard's legal department by noon. It will trigger an immediate freeze on Marcus's firm, Robert warned. They will lock him out of his own building by tomorrow afternoon. Then I suggest he pack his office quickly. I hung up the phone. I sat in the dark for a long time. The house was entirely still, the storm outside finally breaking, leaving behind a brittle, frozen world. I had just signed the death warrant for my son's career. I had initiated a sequence of events that would likely end in his public humiliation, his financial ruin, and possibly his incarceration. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the crushing, suffocating guilt that had defined my motherhood for decades to rise up and choke me. But my eyes remained dry. My breathing was steady. When you sacrifice pieces of yourself to keep other people warm, they don't eventually learn to build their own fires. They simply expect you to keep burning. I stood up, turned off the brass desk lamp, and walked out of the office. Tomorrow, the fire was going out. The next morning dawned violently bright. The sun reflected off the ice-coated branches with a blinding intensity, but the air remained bitterly cold. I was seated in Robert Vance's downtown office by 9:30 a.m. Robert's office was a testament to old money and quiet power. Dark mahogany, walls lined with leather-bound legal volumes, and a heavy silence that absorbed the chaotic noise of the city streets 10 floors below. I sat across from him, reading the affidavit he had drafted. It was a single, devastating page. It stated in clear, unambiguous legal terminology that Eleanor Sterling had zero knowledge of the Vanguard commercial loan, had not authorized the use of her personal assets as collateral, and that the signature on page 42 of the agreement was a fraudulent mark. Attached to the back of the affidavit were copies of my passport stamps, proving I had entered Heathrow Airport on September 12th and had not returned to the United States until September 26th. "Read it carefully, Eleanor," Robert said, his hands folded neatly on his desk. He looked older today, the weight of my family's collapse resting heavy on his shoulders. "Once I transmit this to Vanguard's legal counsel, there is no retracting it. It becomes part of the official record." "I have read it," I said. I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen resting beside the document. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name, my real, true signature, at the bottom of the page, the ink flowing smoothly over the thick paper. Robert took the document, examined the signature, and applied his notary stamp with a heavy, final thud. "It's done," he said quietly. He handed the file to his paralegal, who had been standing silently by the door. "Transmit this to Vanguard's general counsel immediately. Priority delivery." The paralegal nodded and vanished. "Vanguard moves aggressively, Eleanor," Robert warned, leaning back in his chair. "They will likely contact the authorities before the end of the business day. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to report fraud. Marcus will not have time to prepare." "Good," I said, buttoning my coat. Preparation is exactly what he uses to lie. "And what about Chloe?" Robert asked, watching me closely. "Her husband called me this morning. He was frantic is a polite word." "Dan is discovering who he married," I replied. "It is a painful process, but it is not my responsibility to sedate him through it." "He asked for a full accounting of Chloe's outstanding debt," Robert continued, pulling a separate file from a drawer. "I am legally obligated to provide it to him, as she is an authorized user on your accounts. But I wanted to warn you. The total sum is staggering, Eleanor. It's nearly $90,000 in unsecured credit card debt accumulated over the last 14 months alone." $90,000. I felt a brief, hollow ache in my chest. Not for the money. The trust could absorb the loss without flinching. But for the sheer, gluttonous scale of her deception. She had been living the life of a millionaire on the salary of a logistics manager, entirely convinced that her mother would quietly absorb the deficit forever. "Send him the accounting, Robert. Send him every receipt, every invoice, every statement." "It will likely end their marriage," Robert said softly. "Chloe's lies ended their marriage years ago," I corrected. "I simply stopped paying the subscription fee to keep the corpse animated." I stood up, adjusting my purse strap. "Thank you, Robert. I will speak with you later." "Be careful, Eleanor," he called out as I reached the door. "When the water is drained from the swamp, the things living at the bottom tend to thrash." I offered him a small, tight smile. Let them thrash. I took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The city was bustling, people rushing past me with coffees and briefcases, entirely unaware of the private earthquakes detonating in the buildings above them. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out. It was a text from Sylvia. 10 a.m. You didn't call the bank. You've made your choice. You will never see the boys again. Don't bother calling. I stared at the screen. She was so predictable. She was playing the only card she thought she had left, believing that the threat of isolation would break me. She didn't realize I had already spent the last 7 years completely alone. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of my favorite bakery across town. I ordered a coffee and a croissant, sat by the window, and watched the city move. For 2 hours, my phone remained entirely silent, the calm before the storm. At precisely 1:15 p.m., the silence shattered. My phone began to ring with a violent, repetitive urgency. It was Marcus. I let it go to voicemail. It immediately rang again. Marcus. I ignored it. On the third attempt, I answered, holding the phone slightly away from my ear. Mom! The scream was raw, animalistic, and echoing with pure terror. Stop shouting, Marcus, I said calmly. I am drinking my coffee. What did you do? He roared, his voice cracking, the sound of chaos and panic filtering through the background. There are federal marshals in my lobby. They just walked into the firm. They're locking down the servers. Vanguard pulled the funding. Yes, I said. They received my affidavit. Affidavit? He sounded like he was hyperventilating. I could hear someone yelling his name in the background. What affidavit? Mom, what did you tell them? I told them the truth, Marcus. I told them I did not guarantee your $2.5 million development loan. I told them I was in London when the document was signed. There was a sound on the other end of the line, a sharp, ragged gasp, followed by the heavy clatter of a phone dropping onto a desk. Marcus? I said softly. He picked the phone back up. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The aggressive, roaring architect was gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered boy. Mom, please, he whispered, his voice trembling so violently I could barely understand him. Please, they're talking about fraud. They're talking about forgery. You have to tell them you forgot. Tell them you gave me permission to sign for you. Please, Mom, they're going to arrest me. I did not give you permission, Marcus. You forged my name. I was going to pay it back, he sobbed, the denial completely fracturing. The project was solid. I just needed the bridge capital. I would have paid off the loan before you ever noticed. I was doing it for the firm, for Sylvia, for the boys. You did it for yourself, I said, my voice as hard and cold as the ice on my windows. You gambled my home and my security because you could not bear to admit that your business was failing. You stole from me. Mom, please don't let them take me, please. Mister? Sterling? A deep, unfamiliar voice echoed through the phone line. Step away from the desk, please. Keep your hands where I can see them. Mom! Marcus screamed. Mom! The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The screen went black. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The first domino hadn't just fallen. It had shattered. The news of Marcus's arrest hit the local business community with the speed and devastation of a wildfire. By 4 p.m., my phone was entirely overwhelmed. It wasn't just my children calling anymore. It was Marcus's business partners, country club acquaintances, and panicked vendors who suddenly realized the Sterling Architecture Group check they had deposited that morning was going to bounce violently. I turned the phone off completely, dropping it into the depths of my leather handbag. I took another taxi home. As the car crunched its way up my long gravel driveway, I noticed a vehicle parked near the front steps. It wasn't Chloe's luxury SUV, and it certainly wasn't Marcus's Audi. It was a sensible, dented Honda sedan, Dan's car. I paid the driver, stepped out into the freezing air, and pulled my coat tight around my neck. Dan was sitting on the top step of the porch. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was dressed in his beige work slacks and a thin blue sweater, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold. When he heard my footsteps on the gravel, he looked up. His face was completely gray. The mild, easygoing logistics manager I had known for 15 years looked as though he had physically aged a decade since our phone call the previous night. "Dan," I said gently, walking up the steps, "you are going to freeze to death. Come inside." He didn't speak. He simply stood up, his limbs stiff, and followed me into the house like an obedient, deeply traumatized child. I unlocked the front door, ushered him into the warmth of the hallway, and guided him to the sunroom. I directed him to sit in Richard's leather chair, the same chair I had occupied when I dismantled my daughter's financial world 24 hours earlier. I went to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of scotch, neat, the way Richard used to drink it, and brought them back. I handed one to Dan. He took it with trembling hands. "Drink," I instructed. He swallowed half the glass in one violent gulp, wincing as the alcohol burned its way down. He sat staring at the crystal tumbler for a long moment before finally looking up at me. "She lied about everything," he whispered. His voice was completely hollow. It wasn't a question. It was a eulogy. "Yes," I said softly, taking a seat opposite him. "I got the email from your lawyer this morning," Dan continued, his eyes unfocused, staring at a point on the rug somewhere between my feet. $90,000, Eleanor. 90,000. She told me she was using coupons. She told me she was hunting for sales at the outlets. She made me feel like I was a good provider because we were managing so well on my salary. He let out a jagged, broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I bought her a silver necklace for our anniversary last month," he said, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "It was $300. I saved up for 2 months to buy it." She cried when I gave it to her. She told me it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. And the whole time, she was charging $1,500 shoes to your account. "Dan, why?" He suddenly looked at me, his eyes wide and desperate. "Why did she do it? Why wasn't my life enough for her?" I looked at this decent, entirely ordinary man. He was everything my daughter had claimed she wanted when she was 22. Stable, kind, devoted. But Chloe had never truly wanted stability. She wanted the appearance of stability, funded by an endless river of invisible money. "Because Chloe has never known how to endure discomfort," I said honestly. and because she views ordinary life as a personal insult. She married you because you are a good man, Dan, but she used my money because being married to a good man didn't buy her front-row tickets to Aspen." He absorbed the words, his jaw clenching tightly. "I confronted her," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When I got the statement from Robert, I drove home. I printed all 90 pages of the billing history. I dropped them on the kitchen island, and I asked her to explain." He stopped, taking another long drink of the scotch, finishing the glass. "What did she say?" I asked quietly. Dan let out a bitter breath. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look ashamed. She got angry. She screamed at me. She said it was your fault. She said you cut her off specifically to humiliate her, and that if I made more money, she wouldn't have had to ask you for help. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course. To the narcissist, the exposure of the lie is always a greater crime than the lie itself. "She blamed you, Eleanor," Dan said, looking at me with a mixture of awe and profound grief. "And then she demanded I call my parents to ask for a loan to cover the credit cards before the billing cycle ends, so her credit score doesn't tank." "I see." "I told her no." It was the first time in 15 years I had ever heard Dan use that word in relation to my daughter. "I told her I was taking the girls," Dan continued, his voice trembling but gaining a strange, absolute certainty. "I told her I am taking them to my parents' house in Ohio. I am packing their bags tonight. I am leaving her, Eleanor." He looked at me, bracing himself, clearly expecting me to defend my daughter, to beg him to stay, to offer him money to smooth over the marital fracture. I set my glass of scotch down on the side table. "I think that is the smartest decision you have made in 15 years, Dan," I said. He blinked, stunned by my validation. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his shoulders in a rush. "You aren't mad?" he asked. "I am angry that I funded the illusion that kept you trapped," I said softly. "But I am not angry that you are leaving. Protect your daughters, Dan. If you leave them in that house, Chloe will eventually teach them to view you exactly the way she views me, as an obstacle or an ATM." Dan nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I have to go pack," he muttered, standing up. His legs were a little unsteady, but his eyes were clearer than they had been when he arrived. "She's out right now. She went to Marcus's house. Apparently Sylvia is losing her mind because Marcus isn't answering his phone." I froze. The silence in the sunroom suddenly felt incredibly sharp. "Marcus isn't answering his phone?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "No," Dan said, oblivious to the shift in my tone. "Sylvia called Chloe in a panic about an hour ago. Said Marcus left the office this morning and never came home, and his partners are dodging her calls. Chloe went over to Sylvia's to wait for him." They didn't know. The federal raid had happened 3 hours ago, but the authorities hadn't contacted the family yet. Sylvia was sitting in her massive, heavily mortgaged house, surrounded by my grandchildren, waiting for a husband who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, stripped of his suit and his arrogance. And Chloe, entirely consumed by her own financial collapse, had rushed to her sister-in-law's side, entirely unaware that the man who usually bailed them both out was already drowning. "Thank you for telling me, Dan," I said, standing up to walk him to the door. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said, as he stepped out onto the freezing porch. "I really thought we were a good family." "We were a heavily subsidized family, Dan," I replied quietly. "There is a difference. Drive safely." I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt. I stood in the entryway, the silence rushing back over me. My children were currently sitting together in a house they couldn't afford, entirely isolated, waiting for money that didn't exist and a man who wasn't coming home. I walked to the kitchen, picked up the house phone, and unplugged it from the wall. The following morning, the front page of the local business journal did not mention the weather. It mentioned my son. I sat at the kitchen island, a fresh cup of tea resting untouched beside the newspaper. The headline was not large, but it was incredibly precise. "Prominent architect detained amidst Vanguard fraud investigation." The article was brief, clearly written in the chaotic aftermath of the raid. It detailed the sudden closure of the Sterling Architecture Group's downtown office, the presence of federal marshals, and the seizure of the firm's servers. It mentioned a defaulted $2.5 million loan and alluded to irregularities regarding the primary guarantor's signature. Marcus's partners had immediately released a statement distancing themselves from him, claiming complete ignorance and promising full cooperation with the authorities. When a ship sinks, the rats do not stay to comfort the captain. They swim. I folded the newspaper precisely in half, hiding the headline, and slid it to the center of the granite counter. For 35 years, I had believed that if I absorbed the public shame of my family, I was protecting them. When Marcus failed his college courses, I blamed the professors. When Chloe was caught shoplifting as a teenager, I threatened to sue the boutique to keep the police out of it. I had taught them that consequences were something that happened to other people. Now the consequences had arrived at their front doors, heavily armed and demanding payment in full. I walked into the sunroom and retrieved my cell phone from the depths of my purse. I powered it on. The screen immediately flooded with notifications. It was a digital avalanche of panic. 42 missed calls, 68 text messages, 14 voicemails. The timeline of the messages was a perfect psychological map of my family's collapse. The earliest texts from the previous afternoon were from Chloe, dripping with arrogant irritation. "Mom, Sylvia is freaking out. Marcus's phone is off. Tell him to call his wife." By 8 p.m., the tone had shifted to confusion. "Mom, why is your house phone disconnected? Dan isn't answering either. Call me back." By 11 p.m., confusion had violently mutated into pure, unfiltered terror. Sylvia had clearly received a phone call from Marcus's attorney. Sylvia's text from midnight. "Eleanor, what did you do? His lawyer just called. They arrested him. They arrested my husband. Call me right now. You have to fix this. You have to tell them it was a mistake." "Eleanor, answer the phone, or I swear to God you will never recover from this." The final text from Chloe had arrived at 3:14 a.m. It was only 3 words. Dan took the girls. I stared at the glowing screen. In less than 48 hours, the empire of lies they had built on my back had completely disintegrated. Marcus was in federal custody. Sylvia's social status was utterly annihilated. Chloe's marriage was over, and her children were gone. And I had not lifted a finger against them. I had simply stopped holding the ceiling up. I locked the phone screen, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out my heavy wool coat. I did not have any intention of going to the police station. I had no intention of calling Robert to arrange bail for my son. Let Sylvia figure out how to leverage her Pilates studio to post a federal bond. But there was one loose thread I needed to address, one final confrontation that could not be handled through silence or lawyers.
I drove my own car, a sensible 10-year-old Volvo that Richard had insisted I keep because it was practically a tank, down the long, icy driveway. I navigated the treacherous roads toward the affluent subdivision where Marcus and Sylvia lived. It was a neighborhood of aggressive, towering colonials with perfectly manicured lawns and massive, unnecessary pillars. Houses designed not for comfort, but to intimidate the neighbors. I pulled up to Marcus's house. The contrast between the immaculate exterior of the home and the reality of the people inside it was staggering. There were no cars in the driveway. Sylvia's pristine SUV was missing. The blinds were tightly drawn. It looked like an abandoned monument to a ruined king. I stepped out of the Volvo, my boots crunching loudly on the frozen pavement. I walked up the wide brick path, completely ignoring the doorbell, and used the spare key Marcus had given me years ago, a key I had only ever used to drop off Christmas presents or forgotten checks. The lock clicked. I pushed the heavy door open. "Sylvia?" I called out softly, stepping into the massive, echoing foyer. The house was freezing. The heat was clearly turned down or off entirely. The air smelled stale, a mixture of expensive candles and sour panic. "Sylvia, are you here?" I heard a sudden, violent crash from the direction of the formal dining room, followed by the sound of glass shattering against hardwood. I walked quietly toward the noise. The dining room looked like a war zone. The heavy mahogany table, usually set with crystal centerpieces, was entirely cleared. Drawers from the buffet had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Paperwork, silver cutlery, and decorative plates were scattered everywhere. Sylvia was on her knees in the center of the wreckage. She was still wearing the designer sweatpants she had likely put on yesterday morning. Her usually perfect blonde hair was matted, hanging in wild strips around her pale, unwashed face. She was frantically digging through a pile of tax documents, her hands shaking violently. "Sylvia," I said. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide and bloodshot. For a second, she looked like a cornered animal, fully prepared to lunge. When she realized it was me, the fear in her eyes instantly curdled into pure, venomous hatred. "You," she hissed, her voice ragged and hoarse. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the paperwork. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You did this. You set him up." "I did not set him up, Sylvia," I said calmly, stepping fully into the room but keeping my distance. "I merely refused to pay the ransom for his fraud." "He is your son," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, echoing off the high ceilings. "He was trying to save the firm. He told me he just needed the bridge loan to keep the partners from pushing him out." "You have millions sitting in that trust, Eleanor. Millions. It would have cost you nothing to validate that signature." "It would have cost me the truth," I replied, "and I am done financing his lies." Sylvia let out a deranged, bitter laugh, pacing like a caged animal among the broken glass. "The truth?" she mocked,
her voice shrill. "You don't care about the truth. You care about control. You couldn't stand the fact that Marcus didn't need you anymore. You cut off his line, and when that wasn't enough, you sent the feds after him. You wanted to destroy him so he would come crawling back to you." "Marcus hasn't needed me in a decade, Sylvia," I said softly. "He only needed my money. And as for control, if I wanted control, I would have paid the debt and held it over his head forever. I did exactly the opposite. I set him free." "You sent him to prison," she shrieked, grabbing a heavy silver candlestick from the floor and hurling it violently toward the wall. It smashed into the drywall, leaving a deep, jagged dent before clattering to the floor. I didn't flinch. "Where are my grandsons?" I asked, completely ignoring her outburst. Sylvia stopped pacing. She looked at me, her chest heaving, a cruel, triumphant smile slowly stretching across her ruined face. "They're gone," she spat. "I sent them to my mother's house in Connecticut last night. You will never see them again, Eleanor. I will tell them you put their father in a cage. I will tell them you are a monster." "You can tell them whatever you like, Sylvia." I looked around the destroyed room, my eyes settling on the stack of unpaid bills she had been frantically sorting through. "But I suspect very soon you will not have the luxury of focusing on my reputation." Her smile faltered. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Vanguard is not a forgiving institution," I said quietly. "The $2.5 million is gone. The loan is in default. The collateral was fraudulent. The moment Marcus is officially indicted, the firm's assets will be frozen. His partners will sue him for breach of fiduciary duty. Vanguard will come after his personal assets to recoup the loss." I paused, letting the silence rush in and fill the massive, cold room. "They are going to take this house, Sylvia. They are going to take your cars. They are going to take the college funds. By the end of the year, you will have absolutely nothing." Sylvia stared at me, the blood completely draining from her face. The reality of the math was finally overriding her rage. You wouldn't let them," she whispered, the cruelty vanishing, instantly replaced by the terrifying realization of her own vulnerability. "You have the trust. You can protect the house." "For the boys." "The trust," I said softly, turning to walk away, "is entirely closed." "Eleanor!" she screamed, lunging forward, but I was already walking out of the dining room. "Eleanor, wait! You can't just leave me here. I don't have any money." I reached the heavy front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing, blinding sunlight. "You should have smiled and drank the tea, Sylvia," I said. I closed the door behind me, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her stolen life. The drive home was quiet. The ice on the trees had begun to thaw, water dripping heavily onto the windshield of the Volvo. The roads were mostly empty, the world slowly recovering from the storm. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. For nearly 40 years, it had been the nerve center of the Sterling family. It was the place where holidays were hosted, where arguments were mediated, where checks were written, and where apologies were purchased. It had always felt heavy to me, a massive, suffocating structure held together entirely by my silent labor. But looking at it now, as I turned the engine off, the house looked small. It looked quiet. It looked like a building rather than a cage. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I did not immediately walk to the kitchen. I did not check the answering machine. I did not log into my banking app to monitor the fallout of my decisions. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa. The silence was total. For the first time in my life as a mother, there was no crisis to manage. There was no impending disaster requiring my intervention. My son was sitting in a federal holding facility. My daughter was sitting in the ruins of a marriage she had destroyed. And I was sitting on my sofa, completely still, listening to the grandfather clock tick. When you spend your entire life functioning as a safety net, you forget how to walk on the ground. You forget that you are a person rather than a mechanism of salvation. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. It was a call from Robert. I answered it on the second ring. "Eleanor," Robert's voice was crisp, professional, but deeply exhausted. "I have an update from Vanguard's legal counsel." "Go ahead." "The indictment is moving forward rapidly. The U.S. Attorney's Office has officially involved themselves due to the wire fraud element crossing state lines during the transfer of funds. Marcus will be arraigned tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. "And bail?" I asked quietly. "His attorney has requested a hearing to set bail, but Vanguard has filed an emergency injunction to freeze all of his personal and marital assets, claiming they were purchased with the fraudulent funds. The judge granted it an hour ago." I closed my eyes. The math of Sylvia's destruction had accelerated. "So they have nothing," I said. "Correct," Robert replied. "Sylvia's accounts, Marcus's private accounts, the joint marital accounts, everything is locked pending the investigation. Sylvia cannot write a check for groceries, let alone post a federal bond." Robert paused. The line hummed quietly. "His attorney called me 15 minutes ago, Eleanor," Robert said, his voice dropping slightly. "He asked if the trust would be willing to post collateral for Marcus's release. He specifically asked if you would put up the deed to your house." I looked around my living room, the sunlight catching the dust motes in the air, the worn patch on the rug where Richard used to pace when he was on the phone, the quiet, absolute safety of my home. "No," I said. "I assumed as much," Robert said gently. "I told him the trust is currently restructuring and its assets are entirely unavailable." "Thank you, Robert." "Eleanor," Robert hesitated, "Chloe is currently in Marcus's attorney's office. She demanded to speak with me on the conference call. She is entirely unhinged. She is threatening to file a lawsuit against you for intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming you orchestrated Marcus's arrest and her divorce to purposefully destroy the family." A dark, bitter laugh escaped me. Of course she was. Chloe had lived her entire life believing she was the star of a tragedy in which she was the eternal, flawless victim. The idea that she was the architect of her own collapse was entirely incomprehensible to her. If she had $90,000 in debt, it was my fault for cutting off her access. If her brother was in jail, it was my fault for not covering up his crime. "Let her sue me, Robert," I said. "Tell her I look forward to the discovery process. I am sure Dan's divorce attorney will find her credit card statements fascinating reading in open court." I did remind her that a lawsuit would make her financial history a matter of public record, Robert noted dryly. She hung up on me shortly after. "Excellent work, Robert. Is there anything else?" "Just one more thing, Eleanor." Robert's tone shifted, losing the sharp edge of the lawyer and returning to the warm cadence of an old friend. Dan called me this afternoon. He asked me to relay a message to you. He didn't want to call you directly because he felt it would be inappropriate under the circumstances. What did he say? He said he and the girls arrived safely in Ohio, and he wanted to thank you. I felt a sudden, sharp tightness in my throat. I swallowed heavily, pushing the emotion down. Tell him he is welcome, Robert, and tell him I hope he builds a very quiet, very boring life for those girls. I will, Robert said. Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow is going to be a loud day. I hung up the phone. I sat on the sofa for another hour, watching the shadows lengthen across the living room floor. The house was settling around me, groaning slightly as the temperature outside began to drop again. I realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that I had not eaten since the croissant at the bakery that morning. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator. It was well stocked, but I had no appetite for a heavy meal. I pulled out eggs, butter, and a loaf of bread. I was standing at the stove, quietly whisking the eggs, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car turning into the driveway. It wasn't moving aggressively. It was moving slowly, cautiously, as if the driver was terrified of making noise. The crunch of the tires on the gravel was hesitant. I turned the burner down to a low simmer and walked to the front window. It was an Uber. The car stopped at the bottom of the front steps. The rear door opened. Chloe stepped out. She did not look like the woman who had stormed into my hallway 48 hours earlier, demanding that I pay for her ski trip. She did not look like the woman who had spent a decade treating me like an annoying, necessary administrative hurdle. She looked entirely broken. She was wearing a long wool coat over wrinkled clothes. She had no purse, no luggage. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup, and her eyes were swollen and dark. She stood on the gravel, staring up at the house, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. The Uber slowly backed down the driveway, leaving her standing alone in the freezing cold. She didn't move toward the door. She just stood there, looking at the windows, waiting. She was waiting for me to see her. She was waiting for the mother she had spent years exploiting to rush out, throw open the door, and pull her into the warmth. She was waiting for the unconditional amnesty that had always been her birthright. I stood in the shadows of the living room, watching her through the glass. I felt the old instinct rise in my chest, the desperate, crushing need to fix her pain. The urge to run to the door, to wrap my arms around her freezing shoulders, to bring her inside and make her tea. It was a physiological reaction, drilled into me by 38 years of motherhood. "She's your daughter," the instinct whispered. "She has nothing." I placed my hand against the cold glass of the window. "She has exactly what she earned," the truth replied. I turned away from the window. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my spatula, and continued to cook my dinner. I did not go to the door. I did not turn on the porch light. I let her stand in the cold. I ate my dinner at the small breakfast table by the kitchen window. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the toast warm and buttered. I ate slowly, deliberately, forcing myself to taste the food, forcing myself to remain present in the quiet of my own home. Outside, the sun had fully set. The darkness was absolute,
save for the faint glow of the street lamp at the far end of the driveway. I did not look toward the front of the house. For 30 minutes, the silence inside was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I washed my plate, dried it with a linen towel, and placed it back in the cupboard. I wiped down the counters. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Then the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the peace of the kitchen. I stopped moving. My hand hovered over the stove dial. It rang again, longer this time, desperate. I turned the dial, igniting the burner under the kettle, and walked slowly toward the front hallway. I did not turn on the main entryway light. I stood in the shadows, looking through the narrow glass panels framing the heavy oak door. Chloe was standing on the porch. She was shivering violently, her shoulders pulled up to her ears, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She raised a trembling hand and knocked rapidly on the wood. "Mom!" she called out. Her voice was thin, completely stripped of its usual commanding pitch. It sounded remarkably like the voice she used when she was 7 years old, waking up from a nightmare. "Mom, please, I know you're in there. The kitchen light is on." I stood perfectly still, 3 feet away from her, separated only by 2 inches of wood and glass. "Mom, please," she sobbed, leaning her forehead against the door. "It's freezing out here. I don't have anywhere else to go. Sylvia kicked me out. She said I was a parasite. She screamed at me and told me to get out of her house. I don't have my car. I don't have my cards. Dan took the girls. Mom, please open the door." She said I was a parasite. Sylvia, entirely stripped of her own financial armor, had immediately turned on the weakest person in the room. Thieves do not have loyalty. They only have alliances of convenience. When the money vanished, the alliance evaporated with it. "Mom, I'm sorry," Chloe cried, hitting the door weakly with the side of her fist. "I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever you want. I'll get a job. I'll apologize to Dan. Just please, let me inside. I'm so cold." I closed my eyes. The pain in my chest was immense. It felt like a physical weight, a crushing pressure against my ribs. The biological imperative to protect my child was screaming at me to turn the deadbolt, to throw open the door, to absolve her of all her sins and pull her into the warmth. But I had pulled her into the warmth 1,000 times before, and every time I did, she rested just long enough to gather her strength, only to tear the house down from the inside. If I opened that door, the cycle would instantly reset. She would cry on my sofa, drink my tea, and sleep in her childhood bed. And within a week, she would be subtly asking for access to the checkbook. She would blame Dan for leaving. She would blame Sylvia for kicking her out. She would blame me for being cruel. She wasn't apologizing for what she had done. She was apologizing because she was cold. When you rescue a drowning person who refuses to swim, they will inevitably pull you under with them. I had spent 7 years drowning. I was finally breathing air. I was not going back into the water. I stepped closer to the door. I did not unlock it. "Chloe," I said. My voice was quiet, but the heavy oak door did not completely muffle it. She gasped, her head snapping up. She pressed her face against the glass panel,
trying to see me in the dark hallway. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom! Open the door, please!" "No," I said. The word hung in the freezing air between us, absolute and unyielding. Chloe froze. The desperate, pleading daughter vanished, instantly replaced by shock. "What? Mom, it's freezing! I don't have anywhere to go!" "You are 38 years old, Chloe," I said calmly. "You are not a child lost in a storm. You are an adult who spent a decade defrauding her mother, lying to her husband, and living entirely beyond her means. The cold you are feeling right now is the reality you built." "You can't do this," she screamed, hitting the door harder now, anger instantly overriding her tears. "I am your daughter. You have to let me in. This is my house, too." "This is not your house," I corrected her softly. "This is my house. You have treated it like a bank vault for 7 years. The vault is closed." "I don't have any money," she shrieked, kicking the bottom of the door. "My cards are declined. Dan canceled my access to his checking account. How am I supposed to leave? Where am I supposed to go?" "That is a problem you will have to solve without my checkbook," I replied. "I'll freeze to death out here." "You will not freeze, Chloe. You have a cell phone. You have friends. You have the people you bought drinks for in Aspen. Call one of them. Ask them to pay for your Uber. Ask them to give you a bed." She stopped kicking the door. The silence stretched out, heavy and jagged. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she could not call those people. The women she networked with, the mothers at the private school, the friends from the ski resort, they did not love her. They loved the money she spent. They loved the access she provided. If she called them now, completely destitute, they would not answer the phone. She had built her entire social life on a currency she no longer possessed. "Mom, please," she whispered. It was the truest, most broken sound I had ever heard her make. "You're all I have left." "I am all you have ever had, Chloe," I said gently, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. "But you didn't want a mother. You wanted an audience, and you wanted a sponsor. I resign from both positions." I stepped back from the door. "Call a taxi, Chloe. Do not come back to this house." I turned around and walked away from the entryway. "Mom!" she screamed, a sound of absolute primal panic. "Mom, come back! Open the door!" She began pounding on the heavy wood with both fists, the sound booming through the empty house. I did not turn around. I walked back into the kitchen, the sound of her fists echoing behind me like a frantic drumbeat. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. I took it off the heat, poured the boiling water into a mug, and dropped a tea bag inside. I watched the water slowly turn a deep, dark amber. The pounding on the front door continued for another 10 minutes. She screamed my name. She cursed me. She begged. I sat at the breakfast table, blowing gently on my tea, listening to the agonizing death of my daughter's entitlement. Eventually, the pounding stopped. I heard the muffled sound of her crying, fading as she stepped off the porch and walked down the gravel driveway. 10 minutes later, I saw the headlights of a taxi cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees briefly before turning around and heading back down the road. She was gone. I took a slow sip of my tea. It was hot, perfectly steeped, and exactly the way I liked it. I looked at the empty chair across the table. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill it. I was finally alone, and I was completely fine. The next 3 weeks passed in a profound, uninterrupted quiet. I did not turn my house phone back on. I instructed Robert to intercept all communication from my family. If they had a legal need, they could speak to him. If they had a personal need, they would have to learn how to fulfill it themselves. The silence in my home, which had once felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket, now felt like oxygen. I woke up when I wanted to. I worked in the garden, pruning the dormant rose bushes, preparing them for the spring bloom. I read books in Richard's leather chair without checking my phone every 10 minutes to see if a financial disaster required my signature. I was discovering what my life looked like when it wasn't being actively strip-mined. Robert called me on a Tuesday afternoon, precisely 21 days after I had locked Chloe out in a cold. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," Robert said, his tone carrying that specific, measured cadence he used when delivering complex news. "I hope you are well." "I am very well, Robert. The roses are taking nicely to the thaw." "I'm glad to hear it," he replied. "I am calling to give you an update on the landscape outside of your garden. The legal and financial situation regarding Marcus and Chloe has crystallized." "Go on." "Marcus was officially indicted on 2 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft regarding the Vanguard loan," Robert began. Because the trust refused to post collateral, and because all of his personal assets were frozen by the emergency injunction, he remained in federal custody for the past 3 weeks. I looked out the sunroom window. The snow was almost entirely gone, leaving the grass brown and flattened beneath it. "Did Sylvia eventually secure bail for him?" I asked mildly. "She did not," Robert said. "In fact, Sylvia filed for divorce 4 days after his arrest." I paused, holding the phone slightly closer to my ear. I wasn't surprised exactly, but the speed of her abandonment was breathtaking. 4 days? "Yes," Robert confirmed. "She hired a very aggressive family law attorney. She is claiming entirely innocent spouse status, stating she had 0 knowledge of the Vanguard fraud, and is attempting to shield whatever marital assets the federal government hasn't already seized. She has also requested full, exclusive custody of your grandsons, citing Marcus's criminal indictment as a danger to their well-being." "Does she have grounds to shield the assets?" "No," Robert said bluntly. "The federal government does not care about her divorce petition. The house, the cars, the accounts, they are all subject to federal forfeiture because Marcus used them to secure the fraudulent loan. Sylvia's attorney is fighting a losing battle and burning through retainer fees she likely borrowed from her parents to do it." I leaned back in Richard's chair. Sylvia had always viewed Marcus not as a partner, but as a vehicle for her lifestyle. The moment the vehicle crashed, she unbuckled her seatbelt and walked away from the wreckage, completely unconcerned with the man trapped inside. "And Marcus," I asked, "where is he now?" "He took a plea deal yesterday afternoon," Robert said quietly. The words landed heavily in the room. A plea deal. Marcus, the golden boy, the arrogant architect who had spent his entire life believing he could charm or buy his way out of any consequence, had finally surrendered. "He pled guilty to 1 count of federal wire fraud," Robert continued. "In exchange, the U.S. attorney dropped the aggravated identity theft charge,
which carries a mandatory minimum sentence. He admitted in open court that he forged your signature to secure the $2.5 million. What is the sentence? The sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month, but the plea agreement recommends a term of 48 to 60 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He will also be ordered to pay full restitution to Vanguard, though given the liquidation of his firm and assets, he will be paying it off for the rest of his life. 4 to 5 years in prison. I looked at the framed photograph of Marcus on the bookshelf. He was smiling in his tailored suit, holding a blueprint, completely confident in his own brilliance. I thought about the terrified, hyperventilating boy who had begged me over the phone to validate his lie. "How did he look in court, Robert?" I asked. "He looked destroyed, Eleanor," Robert said gently. He looked like a man who finally realized there was no safety net beneath him. "Did he ask for me?" "He did not. His public defender told me Marcus specifically requested that no one contact you on his behalf." I nodded slowly, though Robert couldn't see me. Good. That meant the illusion was truly broken. He had finally accepted that the Bank of Eleanor was permanently closed. "And Chloe?" I asked, shifting my gaze away from the photograph. Robert sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "Chloe's situation is less criminal, but equally chaotic. Dan's divorce attorney formally served her last week. Dan has been granted temporary primary custody of the girls in Ohio. Chloe has been granted supervised visitation, but only if she travels to them." "Has she contested it?" "She tried," Robert said, a hint of dark amusement creeping into his voice. "She hired a lawyer on contingency, claiming she was a stay-at-home mother who was entitled to permanent alimony and child support. Dan's lawyer immediately produced the 90 pages of credit card statements you provided." I closed my eyes, picturing the scene in the mediator's office. "They proved that she hadn't just been spending beyond their means," Robert continued. "They proved she had actively hidden the debt, intercepted the mail, and lied about the source of their income. The judge was completely unsympathetic. Given her massive unsecured debt and lack of employment, she was deemed unfit for primary custody until she can prove financial stability." "Where is she living?" I asked. "According to the court filings, she is currently renting a single room in a long-term motel on the edge of town. She secured a job 2 days ago." That surprised me. Chloe had not worked a formal job since she was 23. "Doing what?" "She is working at a local transmission repair shop," Robert said smoothly, "as a front desk receptionist." The profound irony of it struck me so hard I almost laughed. After lying to me about a transmission repair to steal $4,000, the universe had forced her to sit behind a desk and process honest invoices to pay for her own groceries. God has a very specific, devastating sense of humor. "Thank you for the update, Robert," I said. "I appreciate you handling this." "Are you all right, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice softening. "This is a tremendous amount of destruction for one family to endure in a single month. It is perfectly fine if you are grieving." "I am not grieving, Robert," I said honestly. "I grieved my children years ago while I was still paying for them. I am simply observing the aftermath." "You are a remarkably strong woman, Eleanor." "No," I corrected him. "I was a weak woman for a very long time. I am simply no longer afraid." I ended the call. I sat in the quiet sunroom,
the afternoon light slowly fading into dusk. The family I had spent decades trying to hold together was completely gone. And yet, my house did not feel empty. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and paused in front of the grandfather clock. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. I reached out, opened the small glass door on the clock face, and adjusted the minute hand, moving it forward slightly until it read exactly the correct time. It was perfect. I closed the glass door, turned off the hallway light, and walked into the kitchen to prepare my dinner. Spring arrived with a quiet, undeniable force. The frozen ground softened, the heavy oak branches shed their icy armor, and the garden I had tended for 40 years burst into a violent array of color. It was mid-May when I received the first letter. I was walking back up the gravel driveway, my hands encased in dirt-stained gardening gloves, carrying a bundle of fresh mail. Among the glossy catalogs and utility bills was a plain white envelope. The handwriting on the front was entirely unfamiliar, small, cramped, and leaning slightly to the left. The return address was a P.O. box in a town 2 hours away. I brought the mail inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and sat at the island. I used the silver letter opener to slice the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of cheap, lined notebook paper. Mom, I know you told Robert you didn't want to hear from me. I know you don't want me at the house. I just need you to know that the job at the auto shop fired me. They said I was too distracted because I was trying to coordinate legal calls during my shifts. I have $40 left in my checking account. My rent at the motel is due on Friday. If I don't pay it, I will be living in my car. Please, Mom, I am begging you. Just a small loan. $1,000. I will pay you back. I swear to God I will pay you back. Love, Chloe. I read the letter twice. There was no apology for the $90,000 she had stolen from me. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that she had destroyed her marriage and lost access to her children because of her own greed. There was only the immediate, desperate demand for a solution to a crisis she had manufactured. She was still trying to use the old currency, guilt, panic, maternal obligation, but the exchange rate had dropped to 0. I set the letter on the granite counter. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it away. I walked into Richard's office, opened the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, and placed the letter inside a manila folder labeled Correspondence. I closed the drawer and returned to my garden. Over the next 2 months, the letters arrived with increasing frequency. Some were frantic, scribbled in blue ink, detailing her eviction from the motel and her brief stint sleeping on a former friend's couch before being asked to leave. Some were incredibly cruel, blaming me for her poverty, calling me a monster, claiming that I was intentionally torturing her for my own sick amusement. I filed every single one of them in the manila folder. I never responded. When you engage with a parasite, even to defend yourself, you are still giving it a host to feed on. Silence is the only absolute boundary. In late July, Robert called to inform me that Marcus had formally reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania to begin serving his 54-month sentence. His public defender requested that he serve his time at a minimum security camp, Robert explained over the phone, the connection crystal clear. The judge agreed, given that it was a white-collar, nonviolent offense. It is effectively a dormitory-style facility. I see, I said. arranging a vase of fresh-cut hydrangeas on the dining room table. And Sylvia? The divorce was finalized last week, Robert replied. Because Marcus's assets were seized for restitution, there was virtually nothing to divide. Sylvia was forced to sell the Colonial at a massive loss just to cover the secondary liens Marcus had taken out against it. Where is she living? She relocated to Connecticut with the boys. She is living in her mother's guest house. I understand she has taken a job managing the front desk at a local fitness center. I adjusted a heavy blue hydrangea bloom, stepping back to admire the arrangement. Sylvia, who had once texted her husband to just smile and drink the tea while waiting for me to buy her a $15,000 pool house, was now handing out towels and checking membership cards. Has she attempted to contact me regarding the boys? I asked quietly. No, Robert said, and frankly, Eleanor, I don't believe she ever will. Her entire leverage was based on the illusion that she had power over you. You shattered that illusion. She has no capital left to negotiate with. Good, I said. There is one more thing, Eleanor, Robert said, his tone shifting into the careful, precise register he used when navigating deeply emotional terrain. It concerns Chloe. I stopped adjusting the flowers. What about her? She contacted my office this morning, Robert said. She didn't ask for money. She asked for a legal document. I frowned, wiping my hands on my apron. What kind of document? She requested that I draft a formal waiver of her inheritance rights, Robert said. The silence in the dining room stretched out, heavy and entirely unexpected. A waiver, I repeated. Yes, she stated that she understands she is no longer welcome in your life, and she realizes that the trust will eventually be dissolved or donated upon your passing. But she specifically requested to formally renounce any future claim to the estate. I walked over to the dining table and sat in one of the heavy mahogany chairs. This was a new tactic. It wasn't a demand for cash. It wasn't an insult. It was a preemptive strike, an attempt to seize control of the narrative. Why would she do that? I asked. Because of Dan, Robert explained softly. Dan's attorney filed a motion in family court last week. He is petitioning to make his primary custody of the girls permanent. In his filing, he cited Chloe's ongoing financial instability and homelessness. I closed my eyes. Homelessness. The word felt sharp, a jagged edge cutting through the calm I had built. Chloe is attempting a desperate legal maneuver, Robert continued. She wants to prove to the family court judge that she is entirely severed from the Sterling estate. She wants to claim that she is indigent, not by choice, but because she has been completely disinherited, and therefore she qualifies for state-funded legal aid to fight Dan for custody. She was trying to use her own poverty as a weapon against her ex-husband. She was trying to weaponize the boundary I had set to gain leverage in court. If she formally waives her inheritance, Robert said, she can legally prove she has zero future assets. It is a highly manipulative strategy, Eleanor, designed to cast her as a victim of a wealthy, vindictive family. Will it work? I asked. In family court? Possibly, Robert admitted. Judges are often sympathetic to destitute mothers fighting for custody against stable fathers. I looked at the hydrangeas. They were beautiful, but they required constant water to survive once they were cut. If you stopped watering them, they didn't just wilt, they turned brown, brittle, and eventually crumbled into dust. Chloe was crumbling, and she was trying to drag her daughters into the dust with her. "Robert," I said quietly. "Yes, Eleanor?" "Do not draft the waiver." "She will likely find a legal aid attorney to draft it for her," he warned. "Let her," I said, "but I will not facilitate her attempt to drag my granddaughters back into her chaos. Dan is providing those girls with a quiet, stable life. I will not help Chloe dismantle it." "Understood," Robert said. "In fact," I continued, my voice hardening into absolute certainty, "I want you to do the opposite." "The opposite?" Robert sounded genuinely confused. "I want you to draft an irrevocable trust," I instructed, "a subtrust carved entirely out of my estate. I want it funded immediately, with enough capital to cover full university tuition, housing, and living expenses for both of my granddaughters." I could hear Robert's pen scratching rapidly on a notepad over the line. "And who will be the trustee?" he asked. "Dan," I said. "Daniel Vance will have full, exclusive administrative control over the educational trust. Chloe will have absolutely zero access, zero oversight, and zero legal standing to challenge it." "Eleanor," Robert said, his voice thick with admiration, "that is a masterstroke. If we submit the existence of this trust to the family court during the custody hearing, it proves that the Sterling family is not punishing the children. It proves you are actively supporting their stability through their father." "It proves that Chloe is not a victim," I corrected him. "It proves she is simply irrelevant." "I will draft the documents this afternoon," Robert said. "Dan will be stunned." "Tell Dan," I said softly, "that it is the very least I can do to apologize for the years I spent funding his wife's deception." I hung up the phone. I sat at the dining table looking out the large bay windows toward the driveway. The gravel was perfectly smooth, undisturbed by the frantic arrival of luxury cars demanding payment. The safety net I had woven for my children was permanently destroyed. But out of the remaining threads, I was building a bridge for my grandchildren, a bridge that led far, far away from the wreckage of their parents. November arrived without the violence of the spring storms or the suffocating heat of the summer. It slipped in quietly, carrying a deep, biting frost that hardened the earth and stripped the final brown leaves from the oak trees lining my driveway. The house was incredibly still. In the late afternoon, the mail carrier arrived. I walked down the long, frozen stretch of crushed white stone, my breath pluming in the frigid air, and retrieved a small stack of envelopes from the metal box. I returned to the warmth of the house, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and walked into the kitchen. There were no frantic phone calls to intercept. There were no text messages demanding immediate wire transfers. There were no luxury cars tearing up the gravel outside. There was only a postcard. It was from Ohio. The front displayed a simple, slightly faded photograph of a local apple orchard. On the back, in neat, deliberate handwriting, was a message from Dan. Eleanor, the girls made high honors this semester. We took a weekend trip to the cider mill to celebrate. They are thriving. They smile more now. The trust paperwork arrived yesterday. I don't have the words to thank you, so I will simply promise you this. They will grow up to be women
who know the value of what they have, and they will never take it for granted. We wish you a peaceful Thanksgiving. Dan. I traced my thumb over the ink. A peaceful Thanksgiving. For nearly 40 years, the holidays in this house had been highly orchestrated military campaigns of emotional management. I had spent decades cooking massive, elaborate meals, while Marcus drank my expensive wine and complained about his business partners, and Chloe picked at her food, rolling her eyes at her husband while secretly texting me under the table to ask for shopping money. This year, I had not ordered a turkey. I had not polished the silver. I had not prepared the guest rooms. I walked into Richard's office, opened the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, and placed Dan's postcard inside a new folder, one separate from the thick, heavy file of Chloe's frantic demands. As I closed the drawer, my eyes caught sight of another envelope resting near the back. It was stamped by the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania. Marcus's handwriting. It had arrived 3 weeks ago. It remained completely unopened. I did not need to open it to know what it said. I knew the cadence of my son's manipulation, the way I knew the sound of my own heartbeat. It would begin with a rehearsed apology, pivot smoothly to his physical discomfort in the camp, and end with a quiet, desperate plea for commissary funds or money for a better appeals lawyer. When you strip a narcissist of their armor, they do not suddenly become empathetic. They simply become a victim. I left the letter in the dark, shut the drawer, and turned off the brass desk lamp. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floors of the hallway. The house was settling into its evening rhythm, the floorboards contracting slightly in the cold, the furnace humming a low, steady drone in the basement. I walked back into the kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove. I filled the chipped Wedgwood teapot with water and set it on the burner. I stood in the dim light, listening to the faint hiss of the gas flame. A mother's love is almost always measured by what she is willing to carry. Society teaches us that to be a good mother is to be an eternal beast of burden. You carry their fears, their failures, their debts, their secrets. You swallow your own exhaustion so they can sleep soundly. You hide the ledger of your sacrifices so they never have to feel the weight of what they cost you. No one ever tells you that the ultimate act of love might be putting the burden down. No one tells you that sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the diseased limbs fall away so the roots can survive. I had lost my son to his own arrogance. I had lost my daughter to her boundless greed. But Dan and my granddaughters were safe, insulated by the boundary I had finally found the courage to draw. I had burned the village to save the children. The kettle began to whistle. It wasn't the frantic, demanding sound of a ringing phone. It was just boiling water. I took the pot off the heat. I retrieved a single porcelain cup from the cabinet. I did not pull out a second cup. I did not set a saucer across the granite island. I poured the hot water over the tea leaves. A thin, fragrant ribbon of steam rose into the cold air of the kitchen, twisting and vanishing into the shadows near the ceiling. I picked up the cup and walked slowly out of the kitchen, down the long, dim hallway. I passed the grandfather clock. Its heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth. Tick, tick, tick. a relentless, indifferent measurement of time in a house that no longer belonged to anyone but me. I walked into the sunroom and stood by the large bay windows. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall. The small, delicate flakes drifted down through the darkness, settling silently onto the frozen earth, slowly covering the long, empty stretch of the gravel driveway. There were no tire tracks in the snow. There were no footprints on the porch. For 7 years, I had believed that if I stopped paying them, I would die of loneliness. I had believed that the chaotic, transactional noise of my children was better than the silence of an empty house. I was wrong. I took a slow sip of the tea. It was hot, bitter, and perfectly grounding. I looked back at the empty, immaculate rooms of my home, the untouched dining table, the dark, cold hallway, the heavy, locked front door. I had spent my entire life building a foundation for people who only ever looked at me to see what else they could take. Now the foundation belonged entirely to me. I lowered the teacup, my hands perfectly steady, and watched the snow bury the driveway. The tea was warm, the house was silent, and I was finally, beautifully, completely alone.